Hi there, and thanks for watching. So technically now we're in the third week of the design project, and the first couple of weeks you've had have been spent gathering data as a team. So you've been looking at the playground equipment from a secondary point of view, and last week you may well have gone out and started looking at research from a first-hand point of view, trying to understand the users in playgrounds, who they are, and the types of demographics that might visit playgrounds and what they're like, to try and get a sort of real perspective on the state of play in Christchurch. And between the two, between the first week and the second week, you should have now a nice broad basis of information. So what we're going to start looking at this week is inclusivity and the decisions that are made when designing the equipment in terms of how open they are to be used by wider ranges of people, or how those products are designed specifically for certain types of people. There's a couple of terms, or three terms really, that are all intertwined. The first is human-centered design, and human-centered design tends to relate to the overall process. And you've got accessibility design, which is design for disability, and inclusive design. Now those terms tend to get moved around quite a lot, but they actually are quite different in terms of how they're used collectively. So human-centered design is really in relation to the process that you're approaching with your design project. It's the problem-solving approach that you take in trying to understand the problems that users have and how you initiate inquiry, really. It's your process of inquiry when working with people. That is human-centered design. It's the general approach that you would have towards your design project when working with others. And the tools that you choose to use, how you go about using them, what you choose to do, and its rotation around people. Accessibility is really in relation to, as what they would term, disability, which is kind of a bit of an old term now, making products and services and systems accessible to the wider range of people that would otherwise struggle to use them. And inclusive design really is about making everything universal, that lots of people can use it regardless of their background, which is more of a diversity in approach, which is kind of where you want to sit. But those terms technically sit underneath human-centered design, and they work together as one. Human-centered design, so why is it important? Well, effectively, we're designers. So if we're not actually implementing a user-centered design approach or human-centered design approach to our work, then we're not really designing for people in particular. What we have to do is to make sure that we are. And there's no point designing products or mining the earth for resources if we're just going to build things which have no value to them or no longevity to them or don't match the needs of the people we're designing for. So if you're going to design for people, a human-centered design approach, in my opinion, is the best way forwards. It kind of tends to reduce obsolescence, and if you're creative with it, then what you'll be able to do is maybe propose services and solutions that don't necessarily actually need the product in some cases, in good cases. And it just means you're a little bit more intellectual about your approach. So human-centered design is what I tend to teach you. We used it in the first year, and we're using it now. And like I said, it really is just down to a process. And the project that you're working on now will follow this same pattern. So at the moment, you're sort of empathizing, as it were, on the board here, looking at what you can find and who it involves and what they do. And then over the next week or so, you're going to start to define your opinions on what you found out, what it all means, who we'll be looking at, where's our team going to focus, what area of the project are we going to focus on. That's a process of divergence and convergence. You're divergent in the sense that you're looking broadly, but then you're going to converge when you start to pull together a point of view and filter out the things that you think are essential to take forwards. And that tends to move over three areas of inspiration, ideation, and implementation. And what you'll probably notice is that your assessment points throughout the semester actually line up with that. In terms of your inspiration, there'll be a presentation in week 5. In relation to ideation, there'll be a presentation in week 10. And then in terms of your implementation will be your final presentation at the end of the semester where you present what you've done. And generally, your project will follow this pattern. It's an approach we put last year, and it's a similar approach that we're using now. But there's other diagrams that also pretty much say the same thing. We looked at the design loop before in first year, which is just a process of investigation, of gathering information, information analysis, idea generation, idea analysis. And at the top here is another one as well. It's a human-centered approach. All of them involve the same stages, and all of them involve testing. Now, in some projects, like the one we're doing at the minute, you may well just go through that process once. But in other situations, if you were to develop the project a little bit more integrally or have a longer project, you'd actually repeat that process throughout. And you'd break it down into a series of sequential steps. So the testing point would be where you reevaluate what you're doing and maybe redefine your brief a little bit, and then you move forwards, and then maybe you do that one more time towards the end. So a major project in your final year may well look like that, where you've gone through that process a number of times. You can always just do that at one stage of the project and just refine what you do. And to be honest, the more you repeat this process throughout a project, the better the project will get. And what you will find is it will naturally evolve itself. The more you test your solutions, the more your solutions are obvious of what you need to do in terms of improvement. So if you can't fail your product designs, then the chances are they are successful. So you should always test something to fail it. If you can't fail it, it probably works. Yeah, so you'll probably see these diagrams popping up every now and again, but essentially they are the same thing. What's really important in terms of your process when you're doing design is the type of tools that you use throughout. And at each one of those stages you see here, there are different tools. So if you look at the empathize area, the definition area, ideation and prototyping, there's different tools that we use. And IDEO, the method cards, kind of summarize a lot of the analysis tools, the inquiry tools. But some of the other ones you'll be more familiar with, like brainstorming and co-creation and things like that. But teamwork is an essential part of it, especially with a user-centered design process. And the reason for that is that you need to learn to work together to try and find out as much as you possibly can about the things and people that you're designing for. We sometimes used to look at this as tools of inquiry. That's how we used to call it a little bit, really. But your process of inquiry, the tools you use, will shape your project. And you don't necessarily have to use a lot of them. You can just use one or two here and there. But the choice that you make is important of which ones, depending on what's needed to be found out. So if we're looking here a little bit at a product that was designed with a user-centered design process. Xylus, who make ice cream scoops, decided that they wanted to reinvent or reevaluate the traditional ice cream scoop with IDEO. So of course, the process they would have gone through is pretty particular to what you're doing now. They would have got some ice cream scoops and tested them out with users to find out where the scoops maybe need subtle improvements or redesign improvements. Of course, you could be radical and take the spoon away altogether and then reconceptualize about ice cream distribution if you wanted to. But what they were looking for was an evaluation of a current product. And what they found out was the current scoop, depending on the size of the handle, puts a lot of strain on the wrist, puts a lot of strain on the thumb and the carpal tunnel. There's poor grip on the handle and the edges are quite sharp. So they put a user-centered design process together, human-centered, and they used that information to build a series of prototypes and designs and sketches. And then they tested those prototypes out with users to get further feedback on how well those concepts had performed, which you can see here is an evolution of that concept. And then the information they learned from that then refined the concept once more, and around they went, and this is the one they came up with in the end. Now, in all fairness, it's subtle in its improvement, and one of the things they got awarded for was the fact that they'd redesigned the scoop to be lickable. So apparently people who scoop the ice cream like to lick the ice cream off at the end. That's fine if that's what they wanted to do. But I don't know really how successful it is in terms of being a radical design, but there are subtle improvements to it, such as the shape of the handle. The scooping side was a little bit more tunneled out to allow the ice cream to move more easily, so it's less strain on the wrist, and the angle's slightly better to improve clutch and grip. So a subtle improvement, small bit of styling in there as well, but all of that, simple as it might be, came out of a user or human-centered design approach, which is the one you're going through now. The other way of looking at human-centered design in terms of the success of your product is to ask whether the product, whatever it is desirable, feasible and viable. So desirability tends to focus on, do people actually want it? Do they actually like it? Feasibility tends to focus on whether it can actually be done. Does the technology exist to either make it or build it? And viability is in relation to the cost of it. So for example, if no one likes the product, if it's not desirable, regardless of how feasible and viable it is, if nobody wants it, then it's just not going to work. So if you look at the Sinclair C5, which was a three-wheeler electric car from the 80s, it was feasible and viable to some degree, but nobody wanted it, so it failed, and that company went bust. When you look at the feasibility of something, if something can't physically be manufactured, or maybe it's just not possible to deliver the technology at this particular point in time, then of course the product can't be realised. And even if it's desirable and feasible, but costs the absolute earth to produce it against the cost you could actually charge someone for it, such as if you were buying spoons and they were $1,000 each, unless it was a designer related spoon, which would make your market very small, it's very unlikely you gain market share and profitability. So the sweet spot for innovation is kind of balancing those three out. And if you kind of get it right, you can create or offer to the market a product which people understand, something that's easy to make, and of course, at the end of the day, makes money. If you're more interested in the human-centered design side of things, which is what we're doing right now, and you want to look at it in greater detail, this is a really interesting book. I think the library does have a couple of copies of it, although you'd probably be able to get PDFs of it online, and this is one that I would recommend. Now, building on from looking at the human user-centered approach, what we can do is move on to accessibility, which is, in historical terms, more designed for disability, really. But the way we tend to look at it now is functional limitation, and that tends to group itself into three main areas. You've got the physical limitations, sensory limitations, and brain-based limitations. Limbs, organs, diseases, motor skills, speech, eyesight, touch, smell, hearing, dementia, mental illness. All of these things need to be really considered when designing for accessibility. What we tend to find is if you're designing a product for someone and you're not thinking about these things, you're actually excluding a lot of people that could otherwise use the product. Looking at, say, the university, for example, the university has to consider accessibility on quite a wide scale when bringing in students from different backgrounds. So the obvious one for that would be lifts. So if the lift is designed appropriately, anyone with any ability is able to use it and understand it. But something as simple as that can actually go quite wrong too. There's a lot of examples of bad design and bad accessibility. And it's really just being considerate in terms of accessibility to those that have greater needs or more further needs than maybe what others who are lucky to not have that need. So if you're looking at playground equipment and accessibility, certain equipment in the playground is not potentially that accessible. And it makes it very difficult for others to engage. Now, if they've got a cognitive function or a cognitive problem, or they've got a physical disability or an injury to some degree, then that actually would exclude those individuals from using that equipment. We had a good project brief come in a couple of years ago from a lady who wanted to redesign playground equipment for her son who was wheelchair bound. And I thought it was a fantastic topical brief, which is kind of where this project's come from, actually. And we've been working with her a little bit on the side, and she's now working with the engineering college as well, because I thought the brief was a lot broader possibly than what she wanted, and this is why we're setting it for you to see what you can do with it. But the playground is a really good place to look at that. You can see quite clearly how, if you're thinking about particular users, how they could be excluded from using that equipment. So yeah, you need to consider user limitations, as it were. And as designers, we need to be not ignorant of that. And think about, if you look back at the first year when you did your user empathy project with the visual impairment, there's quite a lot of products out there that haven't really been designed that well for someone that has a visual impairment. And that is basically accessibility. If you can design a product which is accessible, it means that people with rather different limitations can actually use it quite easily. So you need to be thinking about users in this sense as well. This is where design research actually comes in quite handy, because with design research we can actually work quite closely to those that might have a functional limitation to understand their constraints, and we can use that information then to reassess and reevaluate any given product at all. And some of the best design projects I've seen come out final year projects is where someone's worked very closely with someone with a limitation of some sort and redesigned a product or a service to suit their needs. And it's fantastic and enlightening to see it, because you can technically test these concepts out with the users and get real-time feedback. It's very, very important that you're using your users and taking them along as part of the design process for human-centered design. So with human-centered design as a broader term, you need to be involving your users all the way through, right from the start to the finish, to help you refine what is important. But if you can include the users as much as possible, you'll gain much greater insight and much more research-informed innovation. If you take a look at the lift example we had here, if you kind of look at this from an accessibility point of view, it's not particularly friendly. This is probably a good example of bad design, but both the images on the left and the right don't really afford much logic in terms of their order. They certainly don't really help someone maybe that has a visual impairment to some degree. And you could ask other questions as well about, is this easy to access if you're in a wheelchair, or if you have a disability of some sort, this could be difficult to access as well. So the order of hierarchy, the colours, the braille, is it audible? These are questions that you could ask about things like this. But you can, when you look around you every day, you'll start to see actually how badly designed some things really are. Good accessibility, though, on the other hand, does actually try to factor all these things in. So if you take the lift example again, if you're looking at, say, bringing a wheelchair inside a lift, then the height of the buttons is really important to consider. The reach, having them on the left and the right, because obviously you'd have other people in there as well, and you may come in from one side or the other, or you may be left or right-handed, depending on where you are. So accommodating space is very, very essential. In terms of sight, you would have audible sounds, possibly, to indicate where you were, so a voice that might tell you what floor you're on, or tell you when the doors are closing or when they're opening. The buttons themselves may have texture on them. There may be mapping around the outside, so even with your eyes closed or in the darkness, you can still find your way around the elevator. The colours that could be indicative of certain floors or certain elements of controls. The shape of the buttons, putting icons on there as well, which aren't bound to letters or numbers, so people can understand possibly what the buttons mean by the icons and the shape. So if you're looking at an alarm button, you'd have a bell, for example. And the mapping in terms of where buttons are placed, the order and functionality, using sound, visual language, colours, and maybe even vibrations. So when you look at something like this, what you're really trying to do in terms of being accessible, you're trying to think of every eventuality where someone may afford difficulty in using this lift and rule that out through good design. One way of working it out is to ask the question, what's next and what if? You can ask the what if question with any of these designs. So what if the lights go out? What if the person using the lift can't see? What if the lift is really, really full and you're at the back and need to get out? How do you get people's attention? What if? If you ask all the what if questions, then you're more likely to rule out the variables of what is otherwise bad design. If you look at the two examples here of the roundabout in terms of accessibility, the one at the top here doesn't really afford anything. So it's designed well, for example, for someone that is physically able. And so in terms of accessibility, it works well for that. But in terms of the broader sense, it's quite low. And the one at the bottom here has improved accessibility, which isn't actually spelled correctly if I look at that. Improved, needs to be changed. So yeah, the accessibility of those two is very, very different. I wouldn't necessarily say the example on the bottom is an example of inclusive or good design, but it is an example of where accessibility has been used to make the product more specific to a particular user group. Other things that would be important to consider in accessibility would be anthropometrics. So anthropometrics is the study of the human body in all its shape and form, and there is a plethora of data out there in relation to every type of size of body, hand size, man, woman, children. There's a really good book called The Measure of Man and Woman by Henry Dreyfuss. I suggest you look at it and get to grips with it, because it will give you all this information you need. If you're designing equipment that's got to be used by others, regardless of whether it's a piece of playground equipment or a kettle or a toaster or a watch, whatever it is, you have to study this information here to make sure that what you're doing makes sense. It's important to do. So the book I've recommended at the bottom there is really good, and especially for the type of work you're doing now, it's really, really key. If you get this wrong, of course, then obviously your designs aren't going to make sense, and they won't really necessarily be as accessible for your target market. If you're designing something for a child who's 5 or a child who's 10, their hand sizes are very, very different, and their reach is very, very different. So you need to be aware of these things when you're designing your products to make sure that the measurements and sizes and diameters of the handrails or whatever you build is very much in line with the target market which you're designing for. Data-led design, yeah, is very, very important, just like we said. So if you're designing something like up here for the children, if you say that the minimum age range would be 4 or 5, then you can use that data to start working on what the minimum and maximum handrail width and diameters and distances would need to be using that data. And it is an integral part of making your products usable for your target markets. So if we come on to inclusive design, so we've looked at human-centered design and we've looked at accessibility in design. And inclusive design by nature is about considering everything and making it accessible, but not just designing for someone with a limitation. You're actually designing for someone with a limitation, but then opening up that design then to also be useful for someone else who doesn't necessarily have that limitation as well. So if you take the roundabout example before, where that roundabout had been designed for wheelchair use, it actually excluded the wider range of people using it too. So therefore it was too indicative and stigmatized towards wheelchair use, which meant it wasn't necessarily inclusive. So inclusive design can be looked at in a number of different ways. It tends to focus on the full range of human diversity. So this is Microsoft's analysis of inclusive design, and which is interesting because Microsoft do potentially do some fantastic things, and they've really sort of tried to nail this down to three sort of main areas. So you've got the permanent, temporary and situational. So if you're looking at touch, for example, someone with one arm might be a permanent issue that you maybe need to include. So if you're designing a piece of playground equipment for someone that had a lost limb, you could then also look at someone maybe that has an arm injury, and is it accessible and inclusive for them? Then, but also you could look at it in terms of a new parent who also is only using one arm. So inclusive design doesn't necessarily just focus on someone with a functional limitation. It actually considers the types of functional limitation, which may be permanent, temporary, or just situational. And if you start to think about things like this, then you are sort of starting to move into kind of more truly inclusive nature, where you've created a product or service which deals and designates things which fix accessibility issues, but then you're softening them and widening them in your approach to make them applicable to the much wider range of people. And in doing so, what you actually do is develop products which are less applicable to accessibility and more generic, which creates less stigma of the product and makes them more widely accessible, which is the way it should be. So a good example of that would be the OXO peeler. So originally the OXO peeler was designed by the inventor for his wife that was struggling to peel the veg, and she had bad arthritis, or has bad arthritis, and he designed a set of grips on a peeler to actually make it much easier for her to do. But in the process of designing an accessible piece of equipment for the kitchen to sort of address her needs so she can continue to work as normal, and what he actually designed was a really nice piece of equipment that generally works for everybody. So it worked better for everyone. So this is a nice example of inclusive design, where the design is actually to address an accessible need, but in reality, actually, what it does is it's quite inclusive. It means that everybody can use it, and therefore it's not necessarily indicative of a disability or limitation product. But this product would have been designed through a human-centered design approach, where he would have built a number of prototypes, working closely with his wife and evaluating the product's success with her input throughout the process to arrive at this conclusion. So human-centered design being the process of inquiry, accessibility being the need that you're trying to address, but inclusive design being the result of that works better for everybody. So if you come back here to the roundabout example, the roundabout here in this example is human-centered, in the sense that it was designed and built and put together through a process of inquiry of working with people to find out what they would like. It's accessible in the sense that it opens up the use for someone, say, in a wheelchair to use it, and the handrail sizes have been designed and created, and the seat height has been designed and created against the anthropometric data for the type of users that will use it. But it's actually also very inclusive as well, which means it's not necessarily just about designing a roundabout for someone with a wheelchair. It's actually about designing something that everybody can use. So therefore, it's a piece of equipment that anyone can use, and it's not stigmatized for particular use, which kind of makes this a much more inclusive offering in the playground, which is really nice. So as you can see here, the constraint of saying, please take a piece of playground equipment and design it for a specific user market, but you have to improve the accessibility and it must be inclusive, forces a constraint upon the design problem, which can actually result in something quite beautiful. Now, if you look at the harnesses and straps there, a lot of that would have come up from user testing. So obviously the height of those straps, the length of the straps, would have had to have been decided through a process of getting a wheelchair onto that platform, working out the width of it, working out how it can clamp, how it can clip. The only downside to maybe something like this would be if you look at that, it's not particularly clear to me looking at this from a usability point of view how to actually attach the chair to that safely. So there's a number of straps there that might be quite difficult to work out. And on top of that, if you're in there trying to attach them, how easy is it to do that from the other side when you've got the table in the middle in the way? So these are kind of usability issues that you might resolve. And if you were to evaluate this product as part of your design project, you might take this concept and actually improve it based on the issues that you found in actually using that in reality. Now, a good student would try and get hold of a chair, a wheelchair of some sort, and they would role play that out, and they would record it, and they would get on board that, and they would try it out and see why the problems are with it, and actually find out what the issues were, and they would gain insight from that. And they might well write a project brief that says, look, this is a great piece of work, but what we're going to do here is address the problems that we uncovered through our research using a wheelchair in practice, and we're going to fix them with our design concept. So just because that's been done and it's a good example, it doesn't mean it can't be improved. Everything is up for evaluation, and a project like this or a piece of work like that could quite easily be improved in a number of ways, and it's your job to find out. So if we look at the whole system of the things that we've talked about here, generally there's around 4 or 5 different areas that all kind of come together. So human-centered design, as we said before, is the overarching process methodological approach to being a designer. It's the tools that you choose to use, it's when you choose to use them, it's how you choose to use them, and which ones you choose to use. It's the focus on your approach to being a designer through a series of steps. That is human-centered design. That's your philosophy, as it were. And then if you come down, inclusive design at the bottom is part of that human-centered design approach. It's part of the philosophy. It's an attitude. It's a mindset towards being a designer. Thinking about inclusivity as you design is a mindset. And it's an attitude towards design which we choose to take on board. But that focuses on diversity generally, not so much the approach, but it focuses on the diversity of thinking and the diversity of users. But in the center of that, we have the limitations. So considering accessibility and considering usability being informed by interaction and the data that we need to make things usable, and accessibility being informed by our knowledge and understanding of limitations, can be addressed beautifully if you think of it in an inclusive sense, that you solve those problems but then design things in a more open, diverse way to include everybody altogether. Now, if you get that right, and right in the center of that, you can make things desirable, viable, and feasible, which creates value, then you've got a completely holistic, inclusive design project, which is human-centered in approach, and then hits an innovation spot of being desirable, viable, and feasible for business, attractiveness, and feasibility in technology. So these are the things you need to be focusing on. If you can get your project to sit somewhere in the middle like that, which takes a little bit of practice, you'll have a much more realistic solution, which is much more convincing in nature, but is built upon a solid process of human-centered design. Now, this week, you can have a little play around with your definition of inclusivity. So inclusivity we talked about is quite diverse, and you can play around with what that means because you're going to nestle your project somewhere. So now you can think about, like, in terms of, say, diversity could be in relation to social groups. How is the playground equipment that you're currently looking at bringing together different types of social groups? Does it include them? You can look at cultural groups as well. You can look at functional limitations or accessibility limitations. You could focus purely on accessibility of the equipment if you would like as a starting point, and reassess some of that equipment and ask the question, how accessible is this equipment to specific user groups? If someone had a cognitive disability or a physical disability or an injury of some sort, could they potentially use this equipment? Or what if we were to design a piece of equipment for somebody with a cognitive disability? What would we be doing for them? So for example, if you look at autism, or if you look at, say, cerebral palsy, And you take that as a starting point and you accept it and say, okay, so there's not a lot of playground equipment out there that would deal with those two things that we can find. Everything was very physical. So we might say, let's look at a piece of playground equipment for a child who's autistic to help stimulate them and give them an experience of some sort which is rewarding and comfortable. Or you could look at a child with cerebral palsy that has, say, a limitation of movement and maybe design something which is engaging for them so they can learn to play with others. So you could look at it from an accessibility point of view. You can go out and have a look at equipment and assess it against those criteria. But then your solutions, you can start to think about, well, is it possible? Is it possible or plausible that we can also make it inclusive? So whatever solution we came up with for the child with a cognitive limitation, whatever that product is, can we now design that in a way to make it more inclusive to others too so they can engage with this? You can look at age range and diversity, and you could even look at children playing together and how you can improve that. Gender bias, relationships, parent, child, and others. So we want you to kind of define what you think inclusivity is and what it means to you, and then go out there this week and have a look at some of the playground equipment that you've already assessed and look at it with a new perspective and try to uncover how inclusive or accessible, by the definition of inclusivity that your team has, is the equipment that we see on offer. What that then does is put you in a position where you can then choose to evaluate and redesign that equipment with that insight, or you can choose to completely conceptualize a new piece of equipment right from scratch based on that information that doesn't yet exist and is a whole new idea based on those information and insights you've got to back up your reasons for doing it. You can completely take that whichever way you like, whether it's a re-evaluation of a current piece of equipment, a combination of different things, or a new concept idea, that's down to you. But you must this week have a definition of what you think inclusivity means for your group, how you think you can move that forwards, and then you can play around with that in terms of your design project, which starts in 2 weeks. So that's it. Thank you for watching. Good luck, and I'll catch up with you soon. Cheers.